Yoma, Daf Chavav through Lamed Beis. On Daf Chavav, the Mishnah says, Apayas Hashlishi, the third lottery for performing the Avoda, they announced, Chadashim L'Ktaris, Bo Veifisu. Those who are new to the Ktaris, who have never done it before, can join this lottery. Why only those who are new? So the Gemara says, Tana Me'olam Loshana Adamba, no one ever repeated the Ktaris, no one ever got to do it more than once. My Taima, Rabbi Chanina Pnei Shema'asheres. Ktaris makes people rich, we want to spread the wealth, give other people a chance to get rich, so we don't give someone the chance to do the Ktaris for a second time after he's done it once. So the Gemara asks, why is Ktaris unique in this regard? My Taima, what's special about Ktaris? Ilema Mishum Duchsiv, Yosimu Ktara Ba'pecha. Pasuk says that the Kohanim, they do the Avodah, the Ktaris, and then it says, Duchsiv Basrei, Baruch Hashem Chelo. That's followed by Bracha. So Ktaris makes you rich, brings Bracha. So that's Ktaris, that's unique to Ktaris. It's not unique to Ktaris. Ihachi Ola Nami. Carbon Ola should have the same property. Duchsiv, V'chalil Mizbechecha. The same pasuk that says Yosimu Ktara Ba'pecha also says V'chalil Mizbechecha, which refers to an Ola. So Ola also makes you rich. Gemara answers, Amar Le Hashchicha V'halo Shchicha. Ktaris is low shchiach, it's infrequent. Ola is much more shchiach. Therefore what? Rashi says Ktaris is low shchiach, and therefore Ktaris makes you rich. Ola is shchiach, and therefore it does not make you rich. Things which are shchiach don't make you rich, because then everyone will be rich. Not everyone is rich, so only things which are low shchiach make you rich. So Ktaris makes you rich, and Ola does not make you rich. That's how Rashi understands the Gemara. Tos Yeshanim rejects this. Tosis Yeshanim says, the pasuk says, "V'chalil al mizbechecha baruch Hashem chelo." The pasuk clearly does say that Ola makes you rich. So he learns the Gemara differently. He says the Gemara doesn't mean Ktaris makes you rich and Ola doesn't. Rather, the Gemara means when it comes to Ola, there was no need for to say Chadashim la bo veifisu, because anyone can bring an Ola. Since the Ola is shchiach, anyone who wants can bring an Ola. So there was no need to add this rule that only those who were new, only those who had never done it before can do it, because anyone can bring an Ola. So the pressure wasn't you didn't have the same pressure to allow different people to bring the Ola. Ktaris was relatively rare, and you couldn't bring Ktaris ben Nadava, and therefore they had to make the rule of only Chadashim l'Ktaris bo veifisu. Chasam Sofer points out it's a little hard to understand. As long as Ola was common, so what does it matter that Ktaris was not so common? A Kohen would say, I really want the chance to do the Ktaris because it's very rare and I want to get rich. So bring an Ola shchiach. What's the problem? So why do you have to dafka do Ktaris if they both make you rich? That's a problem. But I'll call upon him. We have two pshatim in the Gemara. Rashi says the pshat is things which are lo shchiach make you rich, Ktaris. Things which are shchiach like Ola don't. And the Tos Yeshanim says everything makes you rich. This comes up in the discussion about making someone a sandik more than once. We mentioned a couple of weeks ago, and the Ramah brings from Rishonim an idea that being a sandik, holding the baby at the bris, is like Ktaris, and it makes you rich, and therefore the same rule applies. A father shouldn't honor the same person with sandik more than once for a couple of his children. Nod Yehuda is not convinced. He says not everyone is knowing this way, and one of the arguments he makes is that, according to Rashi, the Gemara says only things which are lo shchiach make you rich. Things which are shchiach don't make you rich. So being a sandik, he says, anything that's shchiach doesn't make you rich. So being a sandik, he says, is pretty common. He discusses, on the one hand, there are many more brises per day than there are ktaris. Ktaris is only brought, as Rashi says, Ktaris is only brought a couple of times a day. But the pamayim b'chol yom, Yehuda says, and sandik is more often. On the other hand, there are far more Jews who are eligible to be sandik. Only Kohanim can bring the Ktaris. There are far more Jews. Do you say vis-a-vis the eligible pool of people that being a sandik is relatively rare, or do you say that on an absolute way being a sandik is pretty common? A lot of brises. He goes back and forth on this. Then he suggests perhaps that would explain why the minhag is not to honor the same person with sandik, but they weren't makbid not to honor the same person to be a moel twice. Why not? Why don't you say being the moel is also a mitzvah? It should also be like Ktaris. Why don't we say you shouldn't make the same person the moel twice? So he says relatively few people are skilled to be moel. So for them it's shchiach. Within the pool of moelim, there's a lot of brises that they get. So for them it's shchiach. So that's not ma'asheres. Masha'enkin being a sandak vis-a-vis the eligible pool of sandaks, pretty much everyone, that's relatively low shchiach. So that's ma'asheres. So that you should not give someone twice. I'll call upon him. He points out this is all within the shita of Rashi, who says that things that are shchiach don't make you rich, and only things which are lo shchiach make you rich. Tos Yeshanim's pshat is everything makes you rich, then this whole thing doesn't apply. And the Chasim Sofer disagrees with the whole approach to the Noda B'Yehuda. He says, even within the sheet of Rashi, he says, there's no svara to say that things that are shchiach don't make you rich and things that are lo shchiach make you rich. He says it's equally likely to make you rich. All the Gemara means, according to Rashi, even according to Rashi, Totzi Sharm has a whole different shayla than Gemara, but even according to Rashi, he says all the Gemara means, the Torah says two things, Ketores and Ola. You want to know which one is Baruch Hashem Chaylo, so there's a svara, the thing that's less shchiach. That's in terms of how to darshan the pasuk. But if you're applying it to other things like Sandak and Mila, then there's no svara to say the thing that shchiach or lo shchiach makes you rich. That he says is if it's like Ketores, it makes you rich. It doesn't matter if Mila and Sandak is shchiach or lo shchiach. On Daf Chav Zayin, the Gemara says, Zar shesider es maracha. A zar, someone who's not a kohen, who arranges the maracha, the fire on the mizbeach, puts the wood on the mizbeach, he's chayev. He's chayev for doing avodah b'zar. A zar is not allowed to do the avodah. What should you do? Parka, you take it off, v'chozer v'sodra, and then you put it back on. The Gemara says if the zar puts it back on, that defeats the whole purpose. He's still a zar. It means the zar, you take it off, parka zar, the sodra kohen, and the kohen should put it back. That fixes things. The Ritva says when we say that it fixes things for a kohen to put it back on, that doesn't mean that the isser of avodah b'zar, the zar who does the avodah does an isser. It doesn't mean his isser is somehow erased or rolled back or ameliorated. The isser is done. What's done is done. What it means is you fix the maracha. The maracha that was set up by a zar is pasul. You take it off, and the kohen sets it up. Now the maracha is kosher. But the avera of the zar remains regardless. Rabbi Tzv Zilberstein brings this up in the context, he has a shaila about if someone eats by mistake on Yom Kippur, he forgot it was Yom Kippur and he ate, should he induce vomiting to uneat, to get the food out? Does that fix the isser? So he says, well, according to the Ritva, it doesn't fix the isser. Taking the thing off the maracha and putting it back on doesn't solve the problem. It fixes the maracha, but the avera is still the avera. So here too he says that removing the food from your stomach, he says it doesn't fix the isser. The isser that's done was done, and there's no point in inducing vomiting. Another version of Rav Zilberstein's remarks, though, he said apparently that it's not so simple. He brings that some achronim say that particularly with regard to Yom Kippur, there's a svara that, at least with regard to Yom Kippur, that it's hanas meyav. That the avera has to do not just with the enjoyment of eating and swallowing the food, it's hanas meyav. The hana of your stomach, of feeling satiated, of having the food in your stomach, that's part of the isser. And if you would vomit the food up and you don't have hanas meyav, even though you enjoyed eating the food, if you don't have hanas meyav, then you'd be patur. And he suggests that according to the Chasim Sofer and the Minchas Chinuch, you would be chayav to vomit it up. Just like when you put bread in an oven, you have to take it out before it bakes on Shabbos, because even though if you leave it there, you don't do anything, you'll be chayav. If you take it out before it gets baked, then you're patur. And you should do that. So here also, in Minatari you have to take it out. So here also, if you can take out the food and you won't have hanas meyav, you're chayav to do that, to avoid the isser. Others suggest that amidas chasidus, you should take it out, so you shouldn't have hana from the isser. Or that, same thing with if you eat tray food, that there's a timtum alev, you should take it out, midas chasidus, not mikra adin, to avoid timtum alev. One is tempted to argue that arguing that you should vomit up the food, it would violate the rule of dracheh darchei noam. It's hard to establish halacha based on this rule. We do have a principle, the Torah's ways are ways of pleasantness, telling us that you should vomit the food, maybe is something the Torah wouldn't ask you to do. And that's what Zilberstein says, at least in his comments on the daf, in Chashukei Chemed, he says, you're not mechuyev to do it, although I saw they bring from another discussion of his, maybe you would be mechuyev to do it, but at least what he says here is that you're not mechuyev to do it, based on the Ritva, that when you take the wood off the maracha and put it back on, you don't roll back the isser, you just fix the maracha. On daf Chavches, the Gemara says, Kiyem Avram Avinu Kol Torah Kula, Avram Avinu fulfilled the entire Torah. Gives examples, it says even a Rubi Tavshilin, Achronim discuss why single out a Rubi Tavshilin. Avram kept the entire Torah. Midrash says he kept even Erev Tavshilin. Some say even Basar B'chalav he kept. How do we know he kept Basar B'chalav? Because when the angels visited in Parshas Vayera, it says Vayikach Ema V'chalav Uven HaBakar. He took first the butter and the milk, and then the meat. V'u'amid Aleim, and he watched them. He was the mashgiach. He made sure they don't mix the meat and the milk. Midaraisa at least, if you keep them separate. That's fine. So he made sure they don't eat meat and milk together. The other versions of this midrash it says first he did milk and meat, and then he did meat, and first he did milk and the butter and the milk, then he did the meat again because he didn't eat them together. He gave them one after another. Avraham Avinu kept basar b'chalav when he fed the malachim. There is a different midrash that says just the opposite. The malachim did not keep basar b'chalav when they visited Avram. Psikta Rabasi brings a midrash The basic midrash is in Masechah Shabbos. It says that when Moshe wanted the Torah, Malachim says, we want the Torah. The Torah belongs in Shemayim. So Moshe answered them that the mitzvahs in the Torah are for people. That they deal with human scenarios. That they're not geared toward you, the Malachim. In the Psikta Rabasi, the midrash Psikta Rabasi, it brings a similar version of the story. That initially the Malachim were persuaded to let the people have the Torah. Because all the mitzvahs apply to people. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Are you kofar in the Malchus of Hashem? Hashem said, these mitzvahs are not for you. So you have people who die. Adam Kiyamas Ba'ol. Nobody dies. Mitzvahs don't apply to Malachim. Mitzvahs apply to people. So the Jewish people got the Torah. Then they sinned at the golden calf. And the Malachim says they get the Torah. It says Lo Yelecha. They're already violating the Torah. So what kind of business is this? I told you, we said you shouldn't give the Torah to them. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you think that you keep the Torah better? He says that they're Mekayim the Torah. Even a child among the Jewish people fulfills the Torah better than you. A kid leaves school, he wants to eat something. It's a basar and chalav. He knows that he can't eat meat and milk together. He has to wash his hands from the meat before he can eat the milk. And when you visited Avram, you ate milk and meat together. Chema, the chalav, ben abakar, you ate milk and meat together. This is the opposite midrashic interpretation. The first midrash says they kept kosher. Avram stood there and made sure they kept kosher. This midrash says no, they did not keep kosher. They ate basar b'chalav together. Rabbi Avram ben Arambam, incidentally, going back to our Gemara, says when the Gemara says that Avram kept the Torah, the Avos kept the Torah, he says it doesn't mean that they kept all the technical halacha we have today. It means that they were ethical monotheists. He says the Emunah and the Achdus Habore, and they had Yiras Hashem and Avos Hashem. They destroyed Avodah Zarah, like Yaakov did in Parshas Vayishlach. That's what they mean when Chazal mean when they said they kept the Torah, the entire Torah. Not that they kept Shabbos or they ate matzah. There are actually midrashim that they ate matzah. And our Gemara says Eruv Tafshilin. It's hard to square Eruv Tafshilin with a general idea of ethical monotheism. That's what Rabbi Avram ben Arambam says. There's also a Ramah. The Ramah says that Chazal say Avram kept Kol HaTorah Kula. Doesn't say the other of us did. So he says that Yaakov married two sisters. Yaakov didn't keep the Torah. So you see, only Avram kept the Torah. When it says L'man asher yitzaveh, he commanded his children, that means the Shav Mitzvah B'nai Noach, but not all the Torah that was unique to Avram. The Ramban, of course, famously struggles with the question of how Yaakov married two sisters. The Ramban has a famous idea that the Avos kept the Torah in Eretz Yisrael, but the Ramah says no, it was only Avram who kept the Torah, the other Avos didn't. There are, however, midrashim. Rashi brings a version of the midrash. In Lavan Garti, Yaakov told Esav, in Lavan Garti is Taryag. I kept the Taryag mitzvahs. Most of the Taryag mitzvahs, except Kibbut Avim and Peri Verivia, according to the midrash. But I'll call upon him. So there definitely are approaches in midrashim and rishonim that all of us kept the Torah. But the Ramah says that it was only Avram, like our Gemara says. Avram Avinu kept the Torah, specifically Avram. On Daf Chav Tes, the Gemara says that Esther was like an ayala. Esther was like a hind. So this is based on, Rashi says, based on the idea that Lametech al Ayelas HaShachar, the Mizmor and Tehillim of Ayelas HaShachar, that was said by Esther, and the Psukim refer to Queen Esther. It says, the Gemara says, why is Esther called Shachar, the dawn? Shachar is Sof Kol Halayla, the dawn occurs at the end of the night. Esther is Sof Kol HaNisim. Esther occurs at the end of all the Nisim, the great biblical Nisim. Esther occurs at the end of the biblical period. That's when Esther took place. This idea that Esther is called Shachar, this comes up in the Gemara in Megillah, which also discusses Ayelas HaShachar. So the Gemara there says, the Gemara brings up Pshat, it says, she has two names, Esther and Hadassah. So the Gemara brings different interpretations, what the significance of her two names was. One sheet in the Gemara was, her real name was Hadassah, her Jewish name was Hadassah. She was called Esther. Esther was her non-Jewish name. The Umas Ha'olam, the non-Jews, called her Esther al-Shum Istahar. Esther is a reference to Istahar. What is Istahar? Rashi says the moon. She was beautiful like the moon. Istahar means Sierra. In Aramaic is the moon. The Dakav Emden says, and the Targum Sheni on Megillah says, no, Istahar is Venus, the morning star, the evening star. That Istahar is Kochav Noga, the planet we call Venus, a very bright light. That's what Esther refers to. Kochav Noga, the Targum says, that she was named after Venus. The non-Jews called her Venus. It's tempting to suggest that this is like Ishtar. Ishtar was one of the names that the pagans used to use for Venus, a goddess. It's a little troubling that Esther's name that we use is named after a pagan goddess, but the Yavitz and the Targum Sheni do say that Esther was named after Venus, after the morning star. In any event, Esther had a non-Jewish name according to the Gemara. The Gemara says that her Jewish name was Hadassah and Esther was a non-Jewish name. Achronim discuss whether it is appropriate for Jews to have non-Jewish names. The Marashtam in the 16th century discusses the Anusim, the conversos, who had converted to Christianity in Portugal and had adopted non-Jewish names. Now they needed to use those names for business reasons when they corresponded with their, now they were living as Jews again when they left Portugal, but they still had reasons to use those non-Jewish names. Is that allowed? Marashtam says, Midas Chasidus, you really shouldn't. Certainly a person should avoid such things, and certainly if this was their baptismal name, Kisha Avru al Rosho, Mayim Asedonim, certainly they should avoid it if they can. Mikra Din, he says it's mutter, and he brings a proof. He says the Gemara talks about, the Gemara says that most of the Jews in Chutz La'aretz, the Mishnah says that the Jews used to use non-Jewish names, and the Gemara says it's mutter. Similarly, Ramosha Feinstein says, regarding English names, he says that it's maguna, it's not desirable to have a non-Jewish name, but mikra din it's mutter. We find many Jews had non-Jewish names. He says in the Magen Mishnah, his name was Vidal. He says the Rambam's father's name was Maimon. The Gemara has Amoraim who had non-Jewish names, Rav Papa, Rozvid, Mar Zutra, Mar Kshisha, Mar Yenuka. They had non-Jewish names. He says that he assumes that when they first started to use these names, probably the people objected, the Gedolim objected, but once they became entrenched, and then at some point they became used for Jews, he says. So at that point he says it is acceptable. He says at this point, he says, and even though Chazal talk about the great schus they had to be redeemed from Egypt because they didn't change their names, he says that was before Matan Torah, before they had the. Now we have the Torah. He says we have a new set of norms that we can use. He says it's Stavrakain, but he's reluctant to say this without Rayas Gedolos. But Meikra Din, he says there's no question. He says that Meikra Din, like Marashtam said, a Jew is allowed to use a non-Jewish name. Milchas Asher, Rav Asher Weiss says, he brings a Maram Shik, who says that a Jew who uses a non-Jewish name violates the biblical prohibition against walking in the ordinances of the non-Jews. So Rav Asher Weiss says, the Hungarian poskim in general were very, very strict in their battle against the reform. Anything that smacked of assimilation they opposed, even things which Meikra Din might not really be Asur. He says, how can the Maram Shik say that a non-Jewish name is Asur? He says, we find, the Gemara says, most Jews in Chutz La'aretz had non-Jewish names. Marashtam says it's mutter. You have to say, he says, the Maram Shik meant in his time, in his context, where using a non-Jewish name was a symbol of assimilation. He says, that's why he was so opposed to it, but Mikra Din, without that context, in a vacuum, he says, it's not strictly Asur for a Jew to have a non-Jewish name. On Daf Lamed, the Gemara is discussing a person who has a little bit of tzoa, a little bit of excrement stuck in his anus. So is he allowed to daven, say Kriya Shema? So the Gemara discusses different technical details of where the tzoa is, if it's visible, if it's not visible. It says if it's not visible, then it's not a problem because Torah was given to human beings, not to the ministering angels. There are limits to how much we can do. If it's not even visible, then it's okay because the Torah doesn't demand the impossible of you. This principle, in the Torah is reasonable, the Torah was given to ordinary human beings, is invoked by poskim in other contexts as well. It appears in the Gemara in several places. It's invoked by poskim in various contexts. One of the most famous is the question of bugs. So you're not allowed to eat bugs, and the poskim say you're supposed to check for bugs. But at some point, poskim say if the bugs are so tiny, they're invisible, you need a microscope to see them, then they're mutter. Because one of the arguments is that God can't expect us to be angels. He can't expect us to see the invisible. If the bugs are really not visible, we say Aruch HaShulchan's language. Rav Asher Weiss is a very interesting tshuva. He says he heard that some poskim were arguing that even if you can't find the bug, but if someone with extraordinarily good eyesight, someone who is extraordinarily skilled can see and find the bug, then it's asur. Because if nobody could find it except literally a malach, that's mutter. But if someone can find it, even if you can't find it, that's going to be asur, these poskim said. Rav Asher Weiss says this is very wrong. He says this is a grave mistake. It's a toast gemura. There's no basis for such a chumra. He says the halachas are always based on what an average person can do, not what an exceptionally skilled person could do. He proves this from numerous places. He says the Torah requires you to check, you to make a good effort to check. He says a good faith effort to inspect the food. You don't have, if you do and you don't find any bugs, he says you don't have to worry that someone with preternaturally good eyesight will find it. If you can't find it, a normal person can't find it, that's fine. We just said, the poskim say that the hetzer of bugs that are tiny, that are microscopic, is l'nitar l'malachi asharis. Mashma only if you need a malach to find it, that's mutter. But if a human being can find it, that's aser. Rav Asher Weiss says no. He says in our Gemara Gufa, in the various Gemaras that bring this principle that the Torah is not given to malachim, the examples in the Gemara are not cases where it's literally impossible. For example, our Gemara, he says, you have a tiny bit of excrement. You could do something about it, he says. If before you daven, you go and take a good shower and wash yourself very thoroughly, you could remove all bits of excrement entirely, he says. It's not impossible, but it means that it's unreasonable. Chazal felt it was too much to ask. Every time a person says Kriya Shmaz, multiple times a day, he has to go through this deep cleansing process. Chazal felt, Baruch Avdaitam, that's too much to ask. So that's what Chazal meant whenever they said, they didn't mean it's literally impossible, they meant it's unreasonably difficult. Therefore, Rav Asher says, in halacha we have this principle, if something is unreasonably difficult, even if it's possible, you don't have to do it. And here too, Rav Asher says, if you look as best as you can, inspect the food, and you can't find the bugs, the fact that somebody could find them who has better eyesight than you, that doesn't matter. Of course, you have to be trained. How much time do you have to spend checking? The devil's in the details. It doesn't mean you can just give a cursory inspection and say, I don't see any bugs. But at some point, Rav Asher says, if you've made a thorough effort, as much as we can reasonably require of you, the fact that somebody else might be able to find it because he has sharper eyesight, that doesn't matter. That Rav Asher feels very strongly. On Lamed Aleph, the Gemara brings a discussion about Bia b'miktzah, Shma Bia Olo. If someone inserts a limb of his into the Hazara, and he's tamei, does he violate the law of entering the Hazara while tamei? Bia b'miktzas, only part of him enters the Hazara. So the Gemara says, B'honas yochichu, that the Bia b'miktzas, the Mitzvah sticks his thumb in for the ritual of his Tara, and it says he's Tovel on B'shar Nikner. He first has to be Tovel before he can do that, because Rashi says he has to be Tovel if he wants to stick even a single aver into the Hazara. It's actually a major machlokus in the Gemara, and a major machlokus we showed him how to paskin, whether Bia b'miktzah Shma Bia or not. Some say it's Asr Midoraisa, some say it's Asr Midrabanan, some say it's not even Asr at all. Rambam says you get Makas Mardus, apparently it's Asr Midrabanan, not Daraisa. The Rabbit says Daraisa. But many poskim, maybe most poskim, say it's Asr at least Midrabanan, if not Daraisa. Bia b'miktzas is Shma Bia. This is discussed in the context of sticking one's hands into cracks in the kosel. You stick your hand in to put a note in, or even I've seen some people say if you don't even stick it in, if you just put your hand on the kosel, if there's a concavity in the kosel, so you're sticking your hand past the edge of the wall, is that Bia b'miktzas? Maybe that should be Asr because you're sticking your hand. It's like going onto the Harabayas, which according to many poskim is Asr. According to all poskim is Asr if you don't go to the mikveh first. So can you stick your finger into the kosel without going to the mikveh first? This has been a major debate for about a century and a half. Some great poskim were stringent. They bring that the Maral Diskin was stringent. They bring that the Steipler was careful not to do it. The Chazon Ish said that he was machmer. On the other hand, other poskim were more lenient. Various Gedolim who were debating the question wrote to the Avnei Nezer back in Sachachav. They asked him about this. The Avnei Nezer had about a half dozen different leniencies, none of which necessarily are slam dunks, but he had a variety of reasons to justify putting fingers into the cracks. He says, first of all, the wall itself may not have had Kedusha, even though going partly into the Hazara or the Harabayas might be Asr, but the wall itself may not have the Kedusha. Furthermore, he says, the Gemara is always talking about the Hazara. The Hazara was the courtyard of the Mikdash, which has more Kedusha, that's Machane Shechina. The Harabayas has great Kedusha also, it's Machane Leviyah, but it's not as strict. Maybe Bia Mikdash doesn't apply to the Harabayas. Furthermore, he says, the Isser may be Derech Knisa, the way you enter, by walking in through a door, he says, if you go through a hole, that's not the way you enter the Hazara or the Harabayas. That's not Derech Knisa. There's no Isser Bia B'miktzas. He says maybe it's only when it's possible for you to go all the way in, and even partly is the first step to all the way in. If it's just a hole, you can't even fit all the way in. Maybe there's no Isser. He says maybe it's only a real limb like a hand. He says maybe just a single finger. Even though the Gemara says Bahonos is a problem, maybe he says just an etzba is not considered Bia B'miktzas. Only other Eivarim is a problem. So none of these reasons is necessarily a slam dunk, but for a combination, for a variety of all these reasons, the Shlomo Zalman Auerbach apparently held that it's only someone who could potentially go in. There's no wall in the way. That's Bia B'miktzas. If there's a wall, you can't possibly get in. Maybe there's no. Certainly, if it's only Drabanan, maybe the Rabbanan weren't goes there. If there's a wall in the way anyway. So there are a variety of reasons why many poskim are mekel. and this is something that is commonly done, but there were poskim who were machmer, there were poskim who said that a person should avoid sticking his fingers into the cracks in the kosel, and maybe even not touch the kosel if there's a concavity there. On Daf Lamed Beis, the Gemara quotes the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that when the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur would shecht the tamid, so he would shecht it, kartzo, which means to shecht it. The Mishnah goes on, umirik achar shrita al yado. He wouldn't do the whole shrita. Someone else would, after he cut some of the neck, someone else would finish the shrita. Why wouldn't he do the whole thing himself? So the Rav says on the Mishnah, and Rashi said earlier in the Masechta, because all the avodas had to be done by the Kohen Gadol. So he had to catch the blood in the bowl. So he had to stop doing the shechita so he can go and catch the blood. How much of the shechita did he do? So the Gemara says, Rov Shnayim. Most of the two simanim, windpipe and esophagus of the animal, he had to do most of the two simanim. Rabbi Yochanan says Rov Shnayim. Rish Lakish says Rov Shnayim. This is the din. Elsewhere the Gemara says of Ruba Kakulo, doing most of something is in many cases as good as doing the whole thing itself. There is a question, whenever we apply Ruba Kakulo, is it lechatchila to actually do the whole thing? Is it better if you do the whole thing instead of simply relying on rov? So there is a bach. The bach says, when it comes to drinking arba kosos, the halacha is you only have to drink rov kos, that the b'diavad yotzi with rov kos, but lechatchila you should drink the whole kos, and the bach understands that the reason for that is because when you say ruba kakulo, that's b'diavad, but lechatchila you shouldn't rely on ruba kakulo, lechatchila you should do the entire thing. What about shechita? Is the halacha that the Kohen Gadol couldn't do the whole shechita, but is the halacha that normally you should cut the whole thing? So the answer is no. Even though it does say in Yeridea that ideally one should cut the entire siman and not rov, that's based on a Gemara, but it's mavur over there. The Bach himself says it's mavur over there. The reason is not because l'chatchila, whenever the Torah says something, you shouldn't rely on rov, you should do the whole thing. The reason is because we're choshesh, if you only do rov, you won't do rov. That if you're barely doing the minimum amount, 1 inch less, 1 bit less, and you won't do rov. L'chatchila, you should have a larger margin of error, you should cut the whole thing. But meikar adin, there is no reason l'chatchila to cut the entire siman. So Bach himself says that. So why when it comes to arba kosas do we say that you should drink the entire kos because of ruba kakulo? So Rav Asher explains, he says that hakol l'fi ha'inyan. Classic Rav Asher Weiss, he says hakol l'fi ha'inyan. He says, a mitzvah that involves avodas Hashem. You're serving Hashem. You're doing what Hashem wants. L'chatchila, you should do as much as you can, as much as the proper share is. When it comes to Mila, he says, l'chatchila, you should take off all the arla. Hashem said the arla is revolting, it's ma'usa. You should cut off all the arla, he says. Dalad kosos, you should drink the whole kos, he says. L'chatchila, you shouldn't rely on rov. Shechita, he says, is a matir. Shechita, Hashem doesn't want you to go around cutting animals' heads off. Shechita is a matir. It allows you to eat meat, he says. Once rov is matir, so it's matir, he says. So when it comes to that, there's no reason to say that shechting more than rov is preferable. A matir is a matir. When it comes to doing the ratzon Hashem, then you should do more the whole thing. How exactly you define he's mechalatin matir and mitzvah, how exactly you define other cases, is it just a matir, or is it even a mitzvah? Depends on the contract. The Rasha says, hakol l'fi ha'inyan.